A woman sits across from an attorney in a wood-paneled office and listens to the words being read out loud. The language is formal, the way legal language always is, but the meaning is not complicated. Joan Crawford, one of the most famous women in the history of Hollywood, has left her estate to charity and to her two youngest daughters. She has left nothing to her eldest daughter, Christina. Nothing to her eldest son, Christopher. The exact wording of the will states, "For reasons which are well known to them." Christina Crawford is 38 years old. She sits in that room. She does not say anything. She already knows what the reasons are. She lived them. What happened next is one of the loudest acts of reckoning Hollywood has ever produced. But to understand it, you have to go back much further than 1977. You have to go back to a child lying on a bathroom floor at 2 in the morning, and a wire hanger gripped in a woman's fist, and the rest of the house completely still and dark around them. What you're about to watch has been buried for centuries. Lost, forgotten, hidden in plain sight. Most people walk past these walls every day and feel nothing. But you clicked. Which means somewhere deep inside you, you already knew there was more to the story. And there is. Every crack, every stone, every shadow on these ancient walls whispers a secret the history books never told you. Welcome to Ancient Walls, where the past doesn't just speak, it screams. Now, sit back, turn up your volume, because what comes next will change the way you see the world forever. Chapter 1. The Woman Behind the Name. Joan Crawford's name carries a specific set of images. The enormous eyes, painted so dark they caught light from across a ballroom. The exaggerated shoulder pads she made into a signature. The lips, always precise, always immaculate, always a shade darker than the room expected. She was born Lucille Fay LeSueur, probably in 1904 or 1905, in San Antonio, Texas, into a world that had almost nothing to offer her. Her father left before she knew him well. Her mother remarried. Her childhood was unstable in ways she spent her entire adult life trying to place behind her. She got out of it by dancing, then by performing, then by getting herself to Hollywood and making herself impossible to ignore. She signed with MGM in 1925. She was given a new name, Joan Crawford. It came from a fan magazine contest, which she publicly hated but privately accepted, because that was what you did when the studio offered you a future. She made films continuously for 50 years. She starred in Grand Hotel in 1932 alongside Greta Garbo and John Barrymore. She won the Academy Award for Best Actress for Mildred Pierce in 1945, a role she received in bed, too anxious to attend the ceremony in person. She made her most celebrated comeback in 1962, opposite Bette Davis, in Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, a film that should by all rights have destroyed her ego and instead rebuilt her reputation entirely. She was married 4 times. Douglas Fairbanks Jr., Franchot Tone, Philip Terry. Alfred Steele, the chairman of Pepsi-Cola, who died in 1959 and left her on the board of the company, a position she took seriously and held for years. She traveled for Pepsi. She gave speeches for Pepsi. She turned up at bottling plant openings in full makeup and high heels in places that had never seen anything like her, which was, in some ways, a perfect summary of Joan Crawford's whole approach to life. She was also a mother. She adopted 4 children. Christina first, in 1939, Christopher, in 1943, and then twin girls, Cathy and Cindy, in 1947. In magazine interviews and on television programs, she described her children as the most meaningful work of her life. Motherhood, she said repeatedly, and with visible conviction, was the most important role she had ever played. She posed for photographs with them. She gave interviews about their schedules, their diets, their schooling. She spoke about wanting to give them the stability she had never had herself. What those 4 children actually experienced, what they each carried out of that house and into their adult lives, and what each of them decided to do with it. That is the story being told today. To understand what it meant to be Joan Crawford's child, you first have to understand what it meant to be Joan Crawford. By the 1940s, she was one of the 10 most bankable performers in Hollywood. She had a staff, a publicist, a personal secretary, a makeup artist, and a hairdresser and a housekeeper. Her home in Brentwood, a large white house, she had bought in 1929 and kept meticulously through multiple husbands and multiple careers, was run to a standard that anyone who spent time in it described as something close to military. The floors were spotless. The closets were color-coded. Every surface had a correct place, and everything was expected to be in it. She could not sleep in a room that was not clean. She could not work in a space that was disordered. The house was an extension of her, and she maintained it accordingly. On film sets, she was famous for her preparation. She arrived with her lines fully memorized, sometimes days before shooting began. She researched her roles thoroughly. She watched dailies obsessively. She understood the camera better than most directors she worked with and had strong opinions she expressed clearly. She was not easy. She was also extraordinarily good at what she did, and almost everyone who worked with her said so, even when they also said she was difficult. She gave to charity. She answered fan mail personally, with handwritten notes in her signature blue ink, even when she did not need to. She visited sick fans in hospitals. She took phone calls from people she did not know who were in trouble. She could be, by all accounts, from people who received her generosity, deeply, genuinely kind. She also wanted things done her way. In the household, this manifested in rules that governed every detail of daily life. Clothes had to be hung on padded hangers, never wire ones. Beds had to be made in a specific manner. Food had to be eaten, entirely, without complaint. Cleanliness was not an option or a preference. It was a requirement. And when her children fell short of her requirements, when they forgot the padded hangers, or made too much noise, or embarrassed her in some way, she had decided was unacceptable. Joan's response was physical. The love and the control came from the same place in her. That may be the most honest thing that can be said about her as a mother. She had survived a childhood she found unacceptable by becoming someone nothing could touch. She wanted her children to be resilient, presentable, disciplined, and proud. She wanted to give them what she had not had. The problem was that the way she knew how to do that was the only way she knew how to do anything, with total commitment, total expectation, and very little room for error. The daughter who wrote it all down. Chapter 2. The daughter who wrote it all down. Christina Crawford came into Joan's life in 1939. She was Joan's first adopted child, brought home as an infant. Joan named her Christina, her own initial, carried into the next generation. She was fair-skinned and blue-eyed, and Joan dressed her carefully and photographed her often and brought her into the public story of Joan Crawford, the devoted mother, right from the start. Fan magazines ran pictures of them together. Joan described her daughter in interviews with a warmth that sounded entirely real, because by every indication, in some deep and genuine way, it was. What set Christina apart from her siblings was her memory. She could place things in sequence. She could hold details years later and find them unchanged. She could feel the gap between the story she was told about her childhood and the story she had actually lived inside. That gap between the fan magazine photographs and the bathroom floor in the middle of the night became the central tension of her entire life. Her early years held both things simultaneously. She had beautiful clothes and prestigious schooling, and a home that any outside observer would have described as exceptional. She had a mother who was one of the most famous women in the world and who told anyone who would listen that her daughter was everything to her. She also had the rules, the standards, the padded hangers and the immaculate beds and the quiet that was expected after a certain hour and the consequences that followed when any of it was wrong. Christina has described the wire hanger incident more times than she can probably count. The details have not changed across 4 decades of telling. She was a young child, late at night. She had hung some clothes in her closet on wire hangers instead of the padded ones Joan required. Joan came into the room and found them. She pulled the clothes from the closet. She beat Christina with the wire hanger, and then she made her clean the bathroom. Not in the morning, right then, in the dark, while the rest of the house slept. There are people who disputed this account from the moment it was published and who continue to dispute it now. Joan's fans, her former co-stars, colleagues who knew her professionally and personally. They found the description incompatible with the woman they had experienced. They said so publicly, and some of them said it very forcefully. And in certain Hollywood circles, the position that Christina was lying or exaggerating was held with a kind of loyal ferocity that made it nearly impossible to have a neutral conversation about any of it. But Christina's account did not change. Not in 1978, not in 1981, not in the years of interviews and documentary appearances and public discussions that followed. The details stayed the same. She said what she remembered, and she kept saying it. She was sent to boarding school more than once. She attended the Chadwick School in Palos Verdes, California. She later studied drama at Carnegie Tech in Pittsburgh. She had inherited something from her mother, whether she wanted it or not, the draw toward performance, toward story, toward the specific craft of inhabiting a character in front of an audience. She worked as an actress through the 1960s. She had small parts in film. She landed a recurring role on a daytime soap opera called The Secret Storm, and then Joan Crawford also took a role on The Secret Storm. Joan was in her 60s by this point. She did not need the work. By every account, she was aware that Christina was employed on the program. She sought out the producers and made herself available for an extended storyline at a time that required, in practical terms, the storyline involving Christina to be substantially reduced. Christina was 29 years old. She lost much of the work she had on the show. Whether Joan did this deliberately, or whether it was simply the gravitational effect of being in Joan Crawford's orbit, the way nothing could exist at the same size as her without getting displaced, Christina has always said it was intentional. She lost other opportunities that seemed to dissolve whenever Joan's influence was close enough to reach. The acting work thinned. The career she had tried to build kept getting interrupted by the career of the woman whose name she carried. By the time Christina was in her 30s, the path she had tried to walk had largely closed over. Joan Crawford died on May 10th, 1977. She was found in her apartment in New York. The cause of death was acute coronary thrombosis. She had been unwell for some time and had kept the extent of it private, in keeping with her lifelong management of her own image. She was somewhere between 71 and 73 years old, depending on which birth record you choose to believe, and that uncertainty was itself a product of the careful mythology Joan had maintained around even the basic facts of her own life. Christina was in New York when it happened. She flew back to California for the reading of the will. The line that excluded her was brief and specific. She and Christopher were named, and then not included, for reasons which are well known to them. 9 words. Joan had signed a revised version of the will not long before her death. The exclusion was not an oversight. It was a decision. Christina went home and started writing. Mommy Dearest was published in 1978, 1 year after Joan's death. It was 286 pages long. It described in close, specific, unhesitating detail what it had been like to grow up in Joan Crawford's house. The wire hangers, the midnight cleaning sessions, the psychological pressure, the cruelties, the contradictions of a woman who could be warm and loving in one moment and frightening in the next. It also described the love. Christina did not pretend the love wasn't there. She described it alongside everything else, which in some ways made everything else harder to hold. The book reached the New York Times bestseller list and stayed there. It was a sensation. Joan Crawford's fan base, organized, devoted, and protective, came out forcefully against it. Former co-stars gave interviews. People who had worked with her on set said the woman Christina described was unrecognizable. A handful of her friends gave statements that amounted to character defense. The publicist community called it opportunistic. Gossip columnists called it revenge. What Christina received was not the vindication she may have been looking for. She received the book's commercial success, and she received 4 decades of being publicly questioned, ridiculed, and second-guessed. In 1981, the film adaptation of Mommie Dearest was released, with Faye Dunaway as Joan Crawford. It was made as a serious drama. It became a camp classic. Audiences began throwing wire hangers at the screen during midnight screenings. Faye Dunaway's performance became a vehicle for impersonation and parody. And Christina, whose account had been the source of the entire thing, watched the story of her own childhood become a joke that other people told at parties. She kept speaking. She gave interviews for decades. She appeared in documentaries. She said in every setting that her only intention had been to tell the truth. She acknowledged that the truth she told was not one everyone wanted to hear. She said that was precisely why it needed to be told. She wrote additional books. She became involved in advocacy around child abuse, speaking about her own experience as evidence of how abuse can exist in plain sight, coexisted with wealth, love, and a perfectly curated public image. Christina Crawford has lived for many years in Idaho, largely outside of the entertainment industry that failed to hold her. She is in her 80s now. She has spent more than 40 years being both believed and disbelieved at the same time, which requires a very specific kind of stamina that most people never need and could not sustain if they did. Her story is one of survival and of what it costs to tell the truth when the person you are telling it about is someone the world has decided to love. The son who carried it quietly. Chapter 3. The son who carried it quietly. Christopher Crawford was born in 1943, the second of Joan's 4 adopted children and her only adopted son. He was brought home 4 years after Christina, into a household that by that point had already established its rhythms and its rules. He was a brown-haired boy, described in Christina's account as someone Joan dressed carefully and displayed publicly alongside his sister, just as she had always done, the devoted mother, the beautiful family, the proof that Joan Crawford's private life matched the warmth she projected on screen. What made Christopher different, and what made his position in the household distinctly difficult, was that he was a boy in a house built entirely around a woman's authority. Joan Crawford had a complicated relationship with men. Her 4 marriages ranged from passionate to practical to professional, and the thread running through all of them was that Joan was not someone who yielded easily to another person's control. She was dominant by nature and by necessity. She had built everything she had through her own effort, and she ran her life accordingly. Christopher was expected to be strong. He was also expected to be obedient. He was expected to meet Joan's standards with the same precision as his sister, while also demonstrating a kind of toughness that Joan associated with masculinity and saw as necessary preparation for a hard world. These expectations were, from the beginning, in conflict with each other. You cannot be strong and unbreakable while also being perfectly controlled. Joan did not appear to register the contradiction. Christina's account of what Christopher experienced in that house is harder to read than her account of her own experience. She describes him as being treated with a particular severity. She describes him being restrained at night on more than one occasion. She describes Joan's physical discipline as harsher toward him than toward herself, though the reasons for that are not something she was ever able to fully explain, because she did not fully understand them as a child, and has not claimed to understand them since. He was sent away. Like his sister, Christopher spent periods of his childhood at boarding school and away from the house in Brentwood. There were stretches where he lived with relatives. Joan sometimes explained these absences publicly as part of his education. Those who knew the family privately understood them differently. He tried to build a career in acting. He had the look for it, tall, dark-haired, the kind of face that would have translated well to the screen in the early 1960s. He had small roles in film and television. He tried to use his proximity to one of Hollywood's biggest names as a lever rather than a burden. It did not work in any sustained way. The name opened certain doors and closed others, and the balance was not in his favor. When Mommy Dearest was published, Christopher was among the first people to publicly confirm his sister's account. He gave interviews in which he said that what Christina described matched his own experience. He was measured in how he said it, careful with his language, but the substance of what he said was unmistakable. He had lived in that house. He knew what the house was like. And then, largely, he stepped back. He did not write a book. He did not pursue a platform built around what he had experienced. He gave some interviews over the years, and he appeared in some documentary contexts, but he did not make the story of Joan Crawford's household the organizing project of his adult life the way Christina did. Whether this was a temperamental difference, a protective choice, or something else entirely, is not something the public record answers clearly. The disinheritance hit him the same way it hit Christina. He was named in the will, and he was excluded in the will, in the same 9-word sentence that contained no explanation and offered no path to understanding. Joan had excluded both of her oldest children from the same document at the same time. The symmetry of that is either meaningful or coincidental, and Joan is not available to say which. What is striking, when you look at the public record of Christopher Crawford, is how little of it there is. For a man at the center of one of the most discussed family stories in Hollywood history, he has left almost nothing behind that he put there deliberately. No book, no sustained campaign, no interview tour. He surfaced when asked, confirmed what he knew, and went back to his life. That is either a man who found a way to carry something without being crushed by it, or a man who found that silence was the only container strong enough to hold what he was holding. Both of those things could be true simultaneously. Christopher Crawford has kept himself out of the spotlight for most of his adult life. He has confirmed that Christina told the truth. He has not told his own version in anything like the same detail. He carries the same origin story as his sister and has chosen to carry it differently. His story is one of quiet endurance and of a man who said enough and then decided that enough was enough. The daughter who defended her. Chapter 4. The daughter who defended her. Cathy Crawford was born in 1947, one of twin girls Joan adopted that year. Her twin sister was named Cindy. Cathy grew up in the same house as Christina and Christopher, arrived there 6 years after Christina, and spent her adult life describing a childhood that is almost impossible to reconcile with her older sister's account. She later married and became known publicly as Cathy LeLonde. What set Cathy apart was the timing of her arrival and the stage of Joan's life she arrived into. By 1947, Joan had just won the Academy Award. She was at the apex of her fame and her power. She was also in the middle of constructing, with great deliberateness, a public identity as a devoted mother. Christina and Christopher had been part of this identity from the beginning, but by the time the twins arrived, the machinery was fully running. Joan brought the girls home to a household that was better prepared, a publicity apparatus that was better organized, and a version of herself that may have been by exhaustion, by calculation, or by genuine development softer than the one her older children had known. Cathy has said repeatedly and clearly that the mother Christina described was not the mother she experienced. She has described Joan as loving and attentive. She has said that Joan took her children seriously, that she was present, that she was interested in who her daughters were becoming. She has described scenes of warmth and care and normalcy that, if you take them at face value, paint a picture of an imperfect woman who was also genuinely trying. The question these two accounts raise is not which one is lying. The more accurate question is whether Joan Crawford might have been a different parent to different children, at different stages of her life. for reasons that had as much to do with her own internal state and circumstances as with the children themselves. That is not an exoneration. It is a way of holding two things that are both true and that do not resolve into a single, clean story. Neither Cathy nor Cindy was excluded from Joan's will. When the estate was settled in 1977, the twin daughters were named as beneficiaries. They received portions of the estate. The contrast with Christina and Christopher, named in the same document and then cut out of it, was not subtle. It was a division Joan made deliberately, and it made a statement that Joan never lived to clarify. In the years after the will, and after Mommy Dearest, Cathy became the most publicly visible defender of Joan Crawford's memory. She gave interviews to newspapers and magazines. She appeared in documentary programs about her mother, including the 1996 A&E biography episode on Joan Crawford. She said in every setting that Christina's account did not match her experience. She was not angry about it, at least not in public. She was consistent. She said what she knew, from where she stood, and she kept saying it. Cathy LeLonde has lived a private life outside of the entertainment industry. She has not sought celebrity. She has not leveraged her position as Joan Crawford's daughter into a public career. She speaks when asked and returns to her own life when the interview is over. She has maintained her defense of Joan's memory for decades without it appearing to cost her anything she was not prepared to pay. For Cathy, the story of Joan Crawford is the story of a mother who loved her. She has never said otherwise. Her story is one of loyalty, unwavering and specific, to a woman the world cannot agree on, the daughter who stayed out of it. Chapter 5. The daughter who stayed out of it. Cindy Crawford, not the supermodel, who came decades later, was born in 1947, alongside her twin sister, the fourth of Joan's adopted children. She later married and became known as Cindy Jordan. She is, of all four of Joan Crawford's children, the one who has said the least about any of it. What defined Cindy from the others was her near-complete removal from the public narrative. Christina gave decades of interviews. Christopher confirmed the account and then receded. Cathy appeared in documentaries and maintained a visible loyalty. Cindy, for the most part, went somewhere else entirely. She has not written a book. She has not sought a platform. She has appeared briefly alongside Cathy in documentary contexts, expressed agreement with Cathy's account, and then returned to a life the press could not easily access. Like her twin sister, Cindy was not disinherited. She received a portion of Joan's estate. Like Cathy, she has described her experience of Joan in terms that do not match Christina's. Like Cathy, she grew up in the same house, but arrived there later, at a time when Joan may have been a different version of herself than the one the older children knew. What this means practically is that Cindy exists in this story largely as confirmation. Confirmation that the twins had a different experience. Confirmation that not every child who grew up in that house came out of it the same way. Confirmation, if you choose to read it that way, that Joan Crawford was capable of being more than one thing simultaneously, or in sequence, or in response to who was in front of her. Cindy Jordan has built a life that the public record cannot see into clearly. Her privacy has been both a personal preference and, in some ways, a quiet form of protection for herself, for the memory of the mother she loved, for the idea that some things do not need to be turned into a story other people can watch. For Cindy, the story of Joan Crawford is something she has chosen, largely, not to tell. Chapter 6. 4 children, 4 truths. Each of these 4 people came out of the same house. They had the same mother. They ate at the same table and moved through the same rooms and grew up under the same roof in the same hills above Los Angeles. And they have each spent the decades since then arriving at accounts of what that was like that cannot be made to agree with each other. That is not, by itself, unusual. Siblings often remember the same childhood differently. What is unusual is the scale, the visibility. The fact that their disagreement has been conducted entirely in public, in print, and on camera, watched by millions of people who formed their own conclusions and held to them regardless of new information. Growing up as Joan Crawford's child meant growing up with two lives running at the same time. There was the life the public saw, the fan magazine photographs, the carefully posed Christmas mornings, the beautiful clothes and the prestigious schools, and the mother in perfect makeup describing her children as her greatest joy. And then there was the life that happened when the cameras were put away. Those two lives were not always the same. How different they were appears to have depended on which child was in the room and when. For Christina, the answer to what she found was a book, a 286-page accounting of everything the cameras did not show. For Christopher, the answer was confirmation and then silence. A man who said his sister was right and then largely stepped out of the way and let her carry it forward. For Cathy, the answer was defense. Decades of consistent, specific, publicly offered loyalty to the memory of a mother she insists was worth defending. For Cindy, the answer was privacy, a life built deliberately outside the story, in a quiet that nobody else could fill. What all four of them share is the weight of the name. Joan Crawford is not a neutral inheritance. She is a myth, a camp icon, a feminist symbol of self-made ambition, a cautionary tale about the cost of perfectionism, and a monster, depending on which account you read and who is doing the reading. Her four children did not choose any of that weight. They were brought into it, chosen by her, given her home and her name and her expectations and her love, which by every account was real, even when it was also something else. None of them asked for it. All of them have spent their entire adult lives figuring out what to do with what they were given. Chapter 7. What Joan was actually trying to do. There is also the question of what Joan Crawford was actually trying to do when she adopted 4 children across 12 years. She could not have biological children. She had tried, and it had not worked. And she wanted children. That part appears to be genuinely true, even accounting for the ways she also used them as props in her public image. She went through legal processes to bring them home. She chose them. She named them. She gave them her house and her household and her attention and her expectations and her love in all the forms that love took when it came from her. She wanted to be a mother. What she was not, despite her extraordinary professional gifts, was a person who had been shown how to be a gentle one. The detail that stays with you is a small one. Christina included it in Mommy Dearest, not as a centerpiece, but almost as an aside. Joan coming into Christina's room when she was ill, sitting on the edge of the bed, putting a cool cloth on her daughter's forehead. Being, in that moment, exactly the mother she described in every interview, careful and present and tender. And then that moment ending, and the other version returning. Christina did not put that detail in the book to make a case for Joan. She put it there because it happened, because a true account of a person contains all of them, not just the version that makes the argument easiest to make. Chapter 8. The contradiction she left behind. Joan Crawford died on May 10th, 1977, in her apartment on East 69th Street in New York. Her housekeeper found her. The cause of death was acute coronary thrombosis. She had been seriously ill for several months and had managed that information with the same careful control she had always applied to her public image. She left behind 4 children, a film legacy that spans 5 decades, and a will containing a sentence that has never been fully explained. The smallest detail that is known about Joan Crawford in her final years, and it is a small detail, private and specific, is this. She continued, even as her health declined, to personally answer fan mail, handwritten, in the blue ink she had always used, not form letters, actual responses to actual letters from strangers, with specific details, with expressions of gratitude, with her signature at the bottom. She answered correspondence from people she had never met until she was too ill to hold a pen. She did not write to Christina. She did not call Christopher. She did not put anything in writing in those final months that could serve as explanation or apology or acknowledgement of what the will was about to do. She knew what it was going to say. She had chosen what it was going to say. And she left for wherever she went next without offering any of the words that her older children had been waiting for their entire lives. The woman at the beginning of this story, the one an attorney's voice describes as having excluded her children by name, is not a villain. She is also not a hero. She is a woman who survived a brutal start and built something extraordinary and paid a price for it that she largely paid in private, and extracted a price from the people closest to her that they are still paying now, decades after her death. She was capable of tremendous warmth towards strangers who loved her from a safe distance. She was also capable of the kind of cruelty that hides in plain sight, because it comes from someone too famous to be accused without consequence. The 4 children she chose, each found their own way of living inside that contradiction. The one who told, the one who confirmed, the one who defended, the one who withdrew. And somewhere in the space between those 4 responses is the truth about what it was actually like to grow up in that house. A truth that is probably not any single one of their accounts, but something that lives in the gaps between all of them. Christina Crawford said in an interview many years after the book was published that she did not hate her mother. She said she had spent a long time trying to understand her. She said she had not entirely succeeded. She said she was not sure that was something a person could fully accomplish. That is about as honest as it gets. Joan Crawford's story has been told many times. The films, the feuds, the 4 marriages, the shoulder pads, the Oscar she received lying in bed too anxious to attend the ceremony. What this video told instead was the story of the 4 people she brought home and called her family, and what the weight of that inheritance cost each of them across the decades that followed. That story does not have a clean ending. It is still being lived by at least 2 of the people in it. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.